Romantasy. Just hearing the word seems to spark all kinds of debates in fantasy. Some people love it, saying it's brought in an element of emotionality lacking in some general fantasy. Others, not so much. They see it as a plague flooding the genre with overused love triangles, brooding bad boys, and of course monster boyfriends. Love it or hate it, you can't deny that books like A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, and From Blood and Ash are everywhere right now. But here's the big question, is Romantasy shaking things up in a good way? Or is it watering down what makes fantasy great? And what does all of this mean for the future of the genre?
In this video, we're finally diving into the Romantasy phenomenon. We're going to explore why it became so popular, unpack the criticisms, and look at what Romantasy brings to the genre. Is it really just watering down fantasy? Is Tolkien turning on his grave over the billionth depiction of a toxic, dysfunctional relationship on page with a fantasy coding? Or could this be a gateway for new audiences and an evolution of storytelling? Stick around as we examine the good, the bad, and everything in between to answer the question, is Romantasy a threat to fantasy? Let's get to it.
Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Romantasy? It's a subgenre of fantasy, where romance is central to the plot, woven into the story alongside other fantasy aspects. Think of it as fantasy, or a fantastical world as a background to longing stares, dramatic confessions, and the plot sometimes just acting as a contextual glue between different intimacy scenes. Let's call it like that, monetization purposes. The staples of Romantasy often include tropes like enemies to lovers, fated mates, and forbidden love. Classic setups that keep readers flipping pages out late into the night. It's where magic meets melodrama, and for some readers that's the sweet spot. From a sales perspective, Romantasy is dominating the fantasy market right now. Titles like Fourth Wing have topped bestseller lists within weeks of release, with publishers rushing to print additional copies to meet demand. A Court of Thorns and Roses has sold millions of copies worldwide and even sparked plans for a TV adaptation, showing the subgenre's crossover potential. On platforms like TikTok, Romantasy titles are some of the most discussed books, driving massive sales spikes and making it easier than ever for new authors to break into the market. With fans creating fan art, posting reviews, and hyping up new releases, Romantasy has become a cultural phenomenon. For publishers, it's clear that Romantasy is a lucrative and growing part of the fantasy genre.
You scroll through this hashtag on your feed, and you're probably going to see endless praise for series like A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, or From Blood and Ash. These books offer a perfect storm from escapism, swoon-worthy love stories, and just enough world building to make it fit the fantasy criteria. Not everyone is on board the Romantasy train, while some readers adore the subgenre for its focus on character relationships, others worry it's sidelining what makes fantasy great. Imaginative world building in magic systems, epic battles, political intrigue, you name it. So, does Romantasy simplify fantasy? That's the big question we're tackling today. So, let's dive into what Romantasy actually does right, what it could do better, and whether it's helping or hurting the fantasy genre as a whole.
One of the biggest criticisms Romantasy faces is that it prioritizes romance at the expense of everything else. Critics argue that while traditional fantasy focuses on world building, magic systems, political aspects, and grand themes, Romantasy often focuses more on the personal stakes. Long-winded descriptions about how badass the female protagonist is and how muscular, broad-shouldered, and virile the male love interest is. These things take precedent over saving the world or fighting cosmic forces. Another common complaint is the heavy reliance on certain romance tropes. Love triangles, brooding bad boys, and fated soulmates are everywhere in Romantasy. And while these can be fun, they can also feel overused if not done well. It's not that these tropes are inherently bad, they're beloved for a reason, but when they dominate the story, it can make the genre feel formulaic.
So, if we talk about Romantasy, or maybe just book talk as a opinion-forming entity, may also be commodifying fantasy. The books are literally categorized into tropey tags, to the point that you can filter, for example, to buy a book online enemy to lovers, slow burn romance, love triangles, to find the books that fulfill those tropes and may interest you, which creates a problem in which the actors are churning out these books with a checklist of tropes to fulfill, like they're preparing a Big Mac menu. It cheapens art to a degree, but hey, if you're having fun with it, go for it. Another troubling criticism of romantasy, it's how we can romanticize toxic relationships. The bad boy trope is a staple in the genre, often crosses the line from brooding and mysterious to outright abusive and toxic. They are sometimes portrayed as domineering, emotionally manipulative, or controlling. Yet, these behaviors are framed as signs of passion and protectiveness. The issues arise when those toxic traits are glossed over or excused because the love interest is attractive, powerful, and has a tragic backstory. For some readers, this sends a harmful message about what love should look like, especially for younger audiences who might take these fictional relationships at face value. But mostly Romantasy's rise sparked debates about how it affects the broader fantasy genre. Some argue that its popularity gives fantasy a lighter, less serious image. Critics worry that the success of Romantasy might push publishers to prioritize similar stories, sidelining traditional fantasy in favor of romance-heavy plots. However, it's worth asking, is that a problem with Romantasy itself, or is this simply the results of changing readers' preferences? Either way, it's clear that Romantasy is reshaping the genre's landscape, and not everyone is happy about it.
One thing Romantasy many times does well is emotional exploration. Romance has this way of making readers feel personally invested in the characters and their journeys. Sure, saving the world is exciting, but when you throw in a relationship where the characters' love for each other is tied to the stakes, it has the potential to hit on a different level. While traditional fantasy often glosses over romance or awkwardly shoves it into the background. Sorry, Sanderson fans, but his romance arcs can feel like afterthoughts written by a 13-year-old. When Romantasy explores this huge side of the human experience, it can contribute to the world's feeling more lived in. Romantasy brings more diversity to the fantasy genre, especially in its focus on female protagonists and relationships. For years, traditional fantasy has been dominated by male-centric narratives. Romantasy flips that script by putting women and their perspectives at the center. This shift has attracted a broader audience, including readers who might never pick up a traditional fantasy book but are drawn to the emotional intimacy and character-driven stories in Romantasy. It's about expanding what fantasy can be and who it can speak to.
The way I see it, Romantasy can also be a gateway into the broader fantasy genre. Many readers start with Romantasy, fall in love with the world building and magical elements as well, and then they move on to explore more traditional fantasy works, going further down their rabbit hole. Beyond that, Romantasy has done wonders to the genre's visibility in mainstream media, but it is hitting a different demographic and making fantasy accessible to a wider range of people, which is a good thing. Love it or hate it, Romantasy is putting fantasy into the spotlight, and that's something traditional fantasy hasn't always been able to do. Again, the main gain here with Romantasy, in my opinion, it's getting different perspectives being portrayed on the genre that we love.
I already mentioned here some of the most popular series in the subgenre, but let's go over them in a bit more detail. Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses, or ACOTAR, is arguably the cornerstone of modern Romantasy. The series starts as a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but quickly evolves into a sprawling tale of fae politics, high-stakes battles, and relationship exploration. The enemies to lovers trope between Fire and Rysand is a fan favorite, offering a classic slow burn development that feels fairly earned. Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Wing has taken the Romantasy world by storm, combining the romance of the genre with a fast-paced, high-stakes plot centered on a deadly dragon riding academy. The book's appeal lies in its intensity, both in its romance and its action. The enemies to lovers dynamic between Violet and Xaden is another fan favorite. The inclusion of dragons, each with unique personalities and bonds with their riders, adds another layer of world building. It strives for a mix of action and romance. Jennifer L. Armentrout's From Blood and Ash series is a Romantasy powerhouse. blending romance with a mix of mystery, mythology, and rebellion. The story follows Poppy, a young woman raised as the maiden, forbidden to be touched or to speak freely, as she discovers hidden truths about her world and herself. The series leans heavily on the fated mates trope. Armentrout also weaves in elements of mythology and supernatural lore, building a world filled with gods, vampires, and ancient secrets. Of course, certain tropes pop up time and again in Romantasy, and part of their appeal is how they are used in new and familiar ways. While some might see these tropes as predictable, fans argue that it's all about the execution.
So I gotta be honest, Romantasy is not my cup of tea. Don't get me wrong, I love complex relationships of all kinds being explored. Relationship dynamics, highlighting aspects of both characters involved in them, and their interaction influencing each other's arcs. Writing this sort of thing well is super hard, and a lot of heavy hitters of fantasy could benefit for having more of this. But at least mainstream Romantasy, at the moment, is not doing this yet for me. These works that I mentioned here are passable at best when it comes to this, but I'm still open to the idea of the genre. I hope to find something Romantasy related that takes this approach and execute this with quality, because I have nothing against the idea of it, just the execution. So if you have an example of this that I'm talking about, please let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to read it.
Obviously, Romantasy doesn't need to replace traditional fantasy. They can peacefully coexist. The beauty of fantasy as a genre is how flexible and diverse it is. There's room for sprawling epics like The Lord of the Rings and character-driven Romantasy like A Court of Thorns and Roses. They cater to different audiences, but they're not mutually exclusive. The coexistence of these subgenres enriches the fantasy world, offering something for everyone. But that doesn't mean Romantasy is perfect, though. How can we make it better? Well, for starters, we can allow both fantasy and Romantasy to bleed into each other a bit better so we can get a best of both worlds sort of effect. God knows a lot of fantasy works out there can learn a thing or two about writing nuanced relationships. Not only romance, but also friendships, mentorships, etc. that don't just feel like bluntly conveying on a page your D&D character's file list of personality traits. Some authors are already finding ways to strike this balance. These kinds of stories prove that it's possible to have the best of both worlds, romance that's meaningful and fantasy that's immersive.
So, in my opinion, Romantasy has a lot of potential if it addresses its criticisms in a good way while staying true to its core appeal. For one, authors could lean into deeper world building, ensuring that the settings feels just as alive and detailed as the relationships. And hey, what the hell, maybe even make your world building details reflect aspects of the relationship you're trying to portray. The world building could work as an allegory, for example. They could also experiment a little bit more with romance plots that are less predictable. Move beyond the love triangles, fated mates, and enemy to lovers formulas to create dynamics that feel fresh and surprising. At the end of the day, in my opinion, fantasy as a genre is better off when it embraces variety and when it's open to explore different things. Romantasy brings in new readers who might never have picked up a traditional fantasy book, while traditional fantasy keeps the genre grounded in its roots. Together, I think they can broaden what fantasy can be, making the genre more dynamic and accessible. So, instead of seeing Romantasy as a threat, we can view it as an expansion of fantasy's possibilities. With all of this said, I do hope that whatever is becoming popular in Romantasy at the moment, it's better written. So,
is Romantasy ruining fantasy? Honestly, the answer is no. It's easy to criticize the subgenre for its overuse of tropes, or for prioritizing romance over other fantasy staples. But Romantasy is expanding what fantasy can be. It's bringing new readers into the genre, offering fresh perspectives, and creating emotional, character-driven stories that many people clearly love. Sure, it's not perfect. There's room for improvement in how it handles world building, relationships, and originality, but that's true of any genre. Romantasy isn't here to replace traditional fantasy. It's here to coexist with it, adding to the diversity of stories fans can enjoy.
So at the end of the day, fantasy has always been about possibility, about creating new settings, and exploring every corner of human imagination. Romantasy is just one more branch of that tree, And while it might not be for everyone, it's undeniably making an impact. You're not obliged to like every single subgenre in fantasy. As long as there's something out there for everyone, that makes me happy. So let's keep the discussion going now. What do you think about Romantasy? Is it a gateway for new readers, a fresh take on fantasy, or just a bit too tropey for your taste? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Also be sure to join our free Discord server for fantasy discussion. The link will be on the channel's page, so look for that if you're interested. And see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.